watching that movie made me think a lot about William Shakespeare. And so tonight I thought I would talk a little bit about the work of William Shakespeare, what I take from it. Because actually Shakespeare is something that's somewhat important to me because of the fact that I had an uncle who was a theater professor. He was a theater professor at DePaul University in Chicago. And he lived in Evanston, and he died when I was 11 years old, and he was very much my hero. And I looked up to my uncle. Visiting my uncle in Chicago when I was a kid was the most thrilling experience, to go to a big city and meet my uncle, who was this theater professor. He was in a bunch of different movies. He was in A Bridge Too Far, and he was in many different movies. And to see him and to be around his theater professor and theater friends of his and hear him talk about Shakespeare was very thrilling for me. So I like Shakespeare. And that's one thing. When I was a kid, my parents made a point, about once a year, a Shakespeare company would come to Wayne County, Ohio, where we lived. We would go see performances of Shakespeare, and we talked about it, right? Talked about it in the household. And so on that note, I wanted to comment on not on the life of Shakespeare and not on the new film that came out, but rather just on some of Shakespeare's works and why they are important. I actually do view Shakespeare's work as very, very deep and very, very profound and meaningful. And it's actually very relevant to a lot of the topics that we discuss right here on this channel. And so I'm going to talk about a couple different works of Shakespeare and what we can take from them, right? Shakespeare is considered the father of English literature. He is, he is the bard, right? The master of the English language, the founder of Western literature and dramaturgy. Shakespeare is a really, really important literary and dramatic figure. And let's just talk about him. So Shakespeare, he had three types of plays: tragedies, comedies, and histories. The tragedies were plays that were very dramatic and usually had not a happy ending, and were about betrayal and negative aspects of the human spirit. The comedies were lighthearted, had a happy ending, and tended to be about romance and romantic interactions. And the histories tended to be, depictions of monarchs, right? They would just be named after monarchs, and it would be, plays about British monarchs who existed. I will say that I relate overwhelmingly to Shakespeare's tragedies, right? The comedies don't really stand out for me. I will mention one of them that I have quite a bit to say about tonight. But for the most part, it's the tragedies of Shakespeare that speak to me. And the first one I want to talk about is Macbeth, right? Macbeth is Shakespeare's tragedy about a Scottish king who becomes a villain. And what Macbeth is famous for is that the tragedy of Macbeth it's the first literary anti-hero. Macbeth starts out at the beginning of the play, he's a good person. But gradually over the course of the play, he becomes a bad person. He becomes more and more power hungry, he becomes more and more ruthless, and eventually his own greed and his own lust for power and his own ruthlessness destroys him. And first it destroys his wife. His wife becomes mentally ill because of his greed and heartlessness. And then eventually, Macbeth himself is killed by his own destructive tendencies. I view the Macbeth tragedy about the Scottish king, Macbeth, King of Scotland, the tragedy of Macbeth. I view that as a play that's largely, I think, speaks a lot to the issue of addiction. It's not literally about substance addiction, but it's about it's about, how do I put this? It's about going against one's own principles and going against one's own beliefs, and not living true to yourself and giving in to temptation, and constantly moving the limits, right? And that's one thing that you see with a lot of addicts. There's a lot of people who become opioid addicts. They say, okay, well, I use opioids, but I'm never going to shoot up. I'm never going to be a junkie. And, give it a year after they become addicted to opioids, pretty soon they're shooting up. And it's like, that's one thing about alcoholism and about addiction, is that with addiction, you start out saying, well, I will never do blank. And then you do it. And then you say, okay, well, I'm doing this, but I'll never do blank. And then you do that. And then you say, okay, well, I'm doing this, but I'll never do blank. That's kind of what the play Macbeth is about. Macbeth starts out as a knight, a king, and he gradually does more and more. The other thing about Macbeth is that Macbeth, there are the weird sisters in the play Macbeth. They're witches, but they're not like, they don't have magical powers. They just have divination abilities. There's these witches who show up throughout the play that are able to predict the future. And, they basically, he goes to them frequently and they tell him what he is capable of, what's going to happen. And he doesn't believe them. And then gradually he fulfills his own prophecy. And then ultimately, at the very end, right? I mean, ultimately, what they tell him is that no man of woman born can ever kill Macbeth, is what they say. And so, turns out, right, he fights Macduff, and Macduff was born with cesarean section, so that's how he's able to kill him. He wasn't woman born; he was born with cesarean section. That's the irony of it. Macbeth is overconfident because he's been told by these witches that were right about everything all along. No man of woman born can ever kill Macbeth. Well, turns out there was somebody who was born via cesarean section, so he's shit out of luck, and he ends up dying in an epic fight scene, at the end of the play. It's quite an action-oriented play, right? And there's a lot of sword fighting and a lot of that. What I will say about the play Macbeth is that, it's his gradually becoming more and more ruthless, more and more power hungry, kind of the original anti-hero of literature, is that his wife becomes insane. And that is actually a really common theme in Shakespeare plays, right? In Hamlet, right, you have Ophelia who goes insane, and you have, a man being an asshole, basically, a man being a selfish asshole and being crazy, and it causes his spouse to lose her mind. And that's kind of interesting. And that kind of, you wonder about, like, later in the 1800s, you had the phenomenon of hysteria, and that whole thing that was a big part of Sigmund Freud and all of that. And it's like, it was like women were able to be crazy in ways that men were not able to, right? If men were crazy, they got thrown in a prison or a mental hospital or killed or something like that. But women could be crazy, in a way that men couldn't. And so, I don't know, you have to wonder about that. That is kind of a theme in Shakespeare, right? Hamlet is tortured and losing his mind. And so then his girlfriend goes crazy and commits suicide, right? And, Macbeth, he becomes ruthless and power hungry, and then his wife starts having dreams of washing the blood off of her hands. And, Macbeth is a very Halloween-y, dark play, right? It very much is. And there's a lot of cultural cliches that come out of it, right? Many, many places we've heard double, double, toil and trouble, cauldron burn and cauldron bubble. That comes from Macbeth, right? Macbeth is an important work of literature. And you could argue it's kind of racist. I would argue it's against Scots, right? Because at the time that Shakespeare was living in, Scots and English people did not get along with each other very well, right? And that there was, eventually, you had the Jacobite uprising that happened later, that was about a century later, but, they didn't get along. Macbeth is very much a stereotype of a greedy Scotsman, right? Scotsmen were portrayed as stingy, power hungry, without empathy, without emotions, cruel-hearted. You have the stereotype of the Scottish Highlanders, right? These mountain people, these wild men in the mountains who wore kilts, and and you can kind of see in the Macbeth play the stereotype of Scotsmen as not as kind-hearted, not as human as the English, right? That kind of comes across if you look at it. And that, adds, if you understand the context of the politics there, right? The fact that, Shakespeare was not going to do a play about an English king like that. He wasn't going to portray an English king as being a ruthless, heartless monster who drives his wife crazy. Now, he could do King Lear, right, which is about a weak king, right, about a king who's weak, my nation for a horse, whatnot. But he's not going to do a king. He's not going to do a play about an English king being ruthless in the same way. I thought that was interesting. Now, the other play that I wanted to talk about, I've got a couple more I'm going to talk about, but Julius Caesar. The play Julius Caesar, I think, is very, very important because, a big part of CPI in our worldview is Michael Parenti's understanding of Julius Caesar as a populist, as a Bonapartist, as a Roman leader who positioned himself as a champion of the people and was trying to reform the Roman political system to benefit the poor, and as a result was stabbed to death by the wealthy senators, and that Rome did not have a sustainable economic model, and that Julius Caesar was trying to change the economic model of the Roman Empire to make it more sustainable. He basically wanted to make the Roman Empire multipolar, and he wanted to give citizenship to the peoples throughout the empire. And the wealthy Roman senators did not want to share power with Julius Caesar, and so they killed him. And in doing so, they ended the Roman Republic, and they paved the road for the fall of the Roman Empire, because Rome was not functioning in a sustainable way. And that, Julius Caesar's critique of the Roman world system, right, Pax Romana, the Roman world system, as it was set up, was not sustainable because it was all centered around one city, and it was the Roman Empire. They controlled the trade routes, and he looked at it and he said, this is not sustainable. We're basically just extracting slaves and extracting wealth from all over the world into one mighty city. We're building up a mighty army to control trade routes, and in the long term, we're not going to be able to hold this together, and we need to start building up other cities within the Roman Empire and giving people in those cities skin in the game. And that, that's our geopolitical understanding, right? That the Roman Empire was an Atlanticist empire. The British Empire that came later, and now the globalist imperialist system, they were the same model as the Roman Empire, and it's not sustainable. An empire based on controlling trade routes to enrich the peoples of a mighty city by impoverishing and extracting from the planet, that's not a sustainable thing. You're not going to read that in Julius Caesar's play. But Michael Parenti's book touches on this, as does Karl Kautsky's important book, The Foundations of Christianity. And if you read then what's coming out in Russia about, geopolitics and Atlanticism and thalassocracy, you can understand why the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire is really, really important to what we're doing, in the Center for Political Innovation. We're developing a geopolitical understanding of imperialism and what can be done in America. America, a republic modeled on the Roman Empire in a lot of ways, that is part of the British Empire system. And so, it's a really important understanding that we've developed. Michael Parenti's very important book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, is very, very critical of Shakespeare's play about the assassination of Julius Caesar, right? The death of Julius Caesar, the tragedy of Julius Caesar, by Shakespeare is it starts out kind of repeating the standard line. If you read standard Roman history, Julius Caesar is portrayed as a dictator, right? As this power-hungry general who was, giving stuff to the poor people in order to give himself more power, and he had to be killed because he was just so power-hungry. But then, the result of killing Julius Caesar was the civil war that ultimately led to the end of the Roman Republic and the monarchy, the empire. So after reading Julius Caesar's work, or after reading Michael Parenti's book on Julius Caesar, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, The People's History of Ancient Rome, I then went and revisited Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And I found that actually, obviously Julius Caesar is not where, Julius Caesar in Shakespeare is not where Michael Parenti puts Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar is not exactly the good guy in the play. But if you really watch the play, the way the Shakespeare play, The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, is it starts out with Julius Caesar being this kind of distant figure who's the super popular, ever victorious general. And it starts out with all the Roman senators getting together and deciding they're going to kill him and talking about how power hungry he is, they can't stand him, and conspiring to kill him. And the audience kind of assumes that's the right thing to do. Then, I believe it's the second act, you have the assassination, right? Julius Caesar goes to the Senate to give his speech. He gets stabbed to death. And then the rest of the play is the Roman senators going, oh shit, we shouldn't have done that, right? And you have the funeral of Julius Caesar, where, you know, Mark Antony gives his famous speech, friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ear. We come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And then you have the mobs of Romans that go around, you know, killing people, and they're just so angry. And then you have the war between Augustus, Octavian, and Mark Antony, and they spend the whole play saying that basically Julius Caesar wasn't so bad. He wasn't so bad. You know, he wasn't so bad. And that honestly, killing him opened the floodgates of creating instability and tore the empire apart and created all these new problems. And however bad Julius Caesar was, ousting him didn't make things better. And that at the time Shakespeare wrote The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, everyone understood this was a political message because there was widespread fear of what would happen when Queen Elizabeth died. Right, the Queen Elizabeth didn't have a child, and she was the last of the Tudor monarchy. And there was a fear that there would be a civil war in England after the death of Queen Elizabeth, because who would replace her? She didn't have a direct heir, and so it would become a fight over who was the rightful one. And it was about basically, if you get rid of the strong leader at the top, as mad as you might be at the strong leader at the top, you know, tearing them down leads to instability and chaos, and it makes things worse, right? And it was a political commentary, right? I always talk about how art reflects the time period it's written in, not the time period, you know, that it depicts, right? Julius Caesar was not writing about ancient Rome. Julius Caesar was writing about England and about how, you know, if you get rid of the king who holds the nation together, then there's instability and civil war, and there was a widespread fear in the country that England would deteriorate into a civil war. And that's what the play was really about. And it was about how they killed Julius Caesar and Rome deteriorated into a civil war. And in that play, right, there's the big line that everyone remembers, is that at one point, you know, they're discussing having killed Julius Caesar. And there's the line, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves who are underlings. And they're saying that basically all the stuff they were blaming Julius Caesar for was actually done by them, right? They were just his followers. And, you know, and the blind worship of Julius Caesar, they were the ones blindly worshiping him. And they were the ones fanatically carrying out his orders. And all the stuff they were mad at Julius Caesar for was actually stuff they did themselves. The fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves who are underlings, right? That is the point. They're realizing Julius Caesar, you know, he may not have been perfect, but he held the empire together, and they got rid of him, and it led to total instability. And that speaks to Khrushchevism, right? That's actually important in Khrushchevism, right? That, you know, tearing down Stalin after the death of Stalin did not make things better and ultimately led to the end of the Soviet Union. Was Stalin perfect? Obviously not. And there's no way that Stalin couldn't have hurt all kinds of people doing what he did. I mean, you know, he decided who got to the front lines and who didn't. He decided who got to eat and who didn't when there were food shortages. Stalin hurt a lot of people, but he was the symbol of the Soviet Union industrializing, the symbol of the Soviet Union getting through World War II, the symbol of a generation that battled against all odds to make Russia a modern industrial country. And when Khrushchev got up after Stalin had died of natural causes, and got up and ranted and raved about Stalin being the worst thing ever, that led to this huge demoralization among the population. I mean, it was the death of the superego, and that the play, the tragedy of Julius Caesar, it's very much about the human relationship with power and authority. We all hate the government, but we all need a government, and we all love the government sometimes, right? And it's kind of like a child's relationship with its parents, right? We all love our parents and hate our parents, right? I mean, if the Oedipal feelings of teenage years are normal and healthy, you need to kind of hate your parents in order to go out on your own, but you also love your parents, right? And that we all have this weird love and hate relationship with power and authority, right? And that there's the Oedipal complex, right? The feeling of the teenage boy wants to kill his father, right? The father is threatened by the teenage boy's level of energy and his youthful testosterone as the old man is starting to deteriorate in his old age, and that's just a natural part of adulthood, of young adulthood for young men. But there's also the fact that you have at the same time, we talk about the superego and transference, and that we all have the desire for a father figure, right? The human mind has three parts, right? You have your ego, which is your thoughts, right? That's just your conscious mind, your thoughts. You have your id, which is your bodily desires, your energy level, exhaustion or high energy, your sex drive, your need to go to the bathroom, hunger, your bodily desires. That's your id. You have your ego, which is your conscious thoughts. But beyond that, you have what's called your superego, or your conscience, your the voice in your head that is demanding that you be better, that is telling you to do the right thing, that is telling you to do your best, that is telling you to live up to higher standards. We all have a superego. And the superego is the source of guilt. If you ever feel guilt about doing the wrong thing, that's your superego talking, right? You have this voice in your head that is often the voice of your parents, right? That you've kind of adopted as part of your psyche. This voice in your head that is urging you to do the right thing, urging you to be better, urging you to do the best. And that voice in your head will never be satisfied. And it drives you crazy because at the end of the day, you will never be good enough for your superego, right? Or else it wouldn't serve its purpose, right? I mean, your superego is always going to demand more of you. And that's the human experience, is that we all are frustrated with our superego because we want to do better. But at the same time, no matter how well we do, we will never be good enough for our superego, right? Our superego is always going to demand the impossible. It's going to demand even better because that's the purpose it serves. It's supposed to make you better. And that the assassination of Julius Caesar, Stalin's demonization of Khrushchev, that is killing the superego, right? That is an attempt to just say, you know what? I don't want to have a superego again. I want to kill my superego. And that is what Shakespeare is dealing with in the tragedy. He's dealing with the fact that the Roman senators got together. Julius Caesar had become the superego of the Roman Empire, and he scared them. He was demanding the impossible. He was taking reforms that they didn't like. So they got together and they killed him. And then what happened? Everything went to chaos because there was no North Star guiding them anymore. There was no one to look up to tell, there was no force of right and wrong. There was no central figure that they could be striving to please. It was like Julius Caesar, as much as they were annoyed with him, as much as they thought he was a tyrant, he was a linchpin that held the Roman Empire together. And they pulled the linchpin out and the whole deck of cards came crashing down. That's what the play is about. And that they created Caesar, that Caesar didn't try to play that role, but he ended up taking it on. And they wanted him to play that role. They needed someone to play the leadership role in the empire. They needed the great ever victorious general to lead the country. And they themselves made him the great leader that he was. And they worshiped him and they gave him the power. And it was them who created and made Julius Caesar what he was, because they needed someone to play that role. And then they hated him for playing that role. And this is a really common thing. I mean, Richard Nixon is a great example of this. I don't think Richard Nixon was a great guy, But Richard Nixon is remembered in American history because he's the only American president who's ever resigned. He was facing impeachment proceedings and he resigned. And at the time that Richard Nixon resigned, it was all over the media that Richard Nixon was becoming a dictator. And I mean, it was true to some degree or other. He had an enemies list, right? He had sent the FBI to crush the Black Panthers. He was going after his political rivals. And so 1974, the US media said, oh my God, Richard Nixon, he wants to be a king, he wants to be a dictator, and he was impeached. But why was Richard Nixon doing that? Because the US ruling class had needed him to do that. Because in 1968, when he was elected president, there was a huge rebellion among the Black community, and the anti-Vietnam War was exploding everywhere. And at that point, the Cold War liberals weren't getting the job done. And we had Kennedy before that, Eisenhower, a very liberal Republican, then Kennedy, then Lyndon Johnson, and a big section of the ruling class said, you know what? We need an authoritarian, right-wing strongman to crush the Black Panthers and crush the students and go all in Vietnam. And if he can't go all in, then pull out. And so Richard Nixon came into office with the bulk of the American ruling class wanting him to be a dictator, wanting him to be an authoritarian strongman. And then he came in and he did what he was supposed to do. He told the FBI to take the gloves off and crush the Black Panthers. He escalated the Vietnam War very dramatically. And then when it became clear they weren't going to win, he pulled out of Vietnam and he lowered the voting age to 18. And he went to China and he met with Mao. And he took all kinds of dramatic moves as a strong man. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, and Nixon did all kinds of stuff. He did his Nixon shocks, right? He took the USA off the gold standard. He created a wage and price freeze. He did all kinds of very, very dramatic moves that U.S. presidents don't generally do, right? Really, since Roosevelt, we never had a president who took so many dramatic moves, not all of which were good. I mean, escalating the Vietnam War and killing millions of Vietnamese people, not good. Crushing the Black Panthers ruthlessly, not good. He did a lot of bad things. But the point is, the U.S. ruling class wanted him to do those bad things. They picked him to do that. And then he did it. And by 1974, the Black Freedom Movement was in decline, and the anti-Vietnam War movement was in decline because the war was over. And all of a sudden, it was all over TV. Richard Nixon wants to be a dictator. Richard Nixon is an authoritarian strongman. Well, what they wanted, that's the job he signed up for. That's the job you gave him. And the very same American political establishment that created Richard Nixon to be the authoritarian strongman ousted him for being an authoritarian strongman. And that's kind of similar to the Julius Caesar thing, right? They created Caesar. The fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, who are underlings, right? And the Julius Caesar play is really deep in terms of politics. It's very, very deep in terms of human psychology and in terms of politics. I actually would encourage you to go read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and understand the context of he's fearing, and there was widespread fear in England at that time, that would happen after the death of Queen Elizabeth, that England would go the same way as the Roman Empire, and they would have another big, ugly war between the different dynasties, the different houses, etc. So that's Julius Caesar. I really do recommend. It's very important to what we talk about on here. Now, another play that I do want to comment on. This one's a comedy, and I want to comment on it. I don't even want to comment on the play, first of all. I want to comment on how it is perceived, right? Because there's a couple things about it. So the play is The Merchant of Venice, right? And The Merchant of Venice is one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, and it's anti-Semitic. I mean, and it is. I mean, look, it was written at the time it was written, in the context of the time it was written. It is an anti-Semitic play. But here's the thing, right? I have, first of all, in the Middle East, they don't speak English. They speak Arabic. Maybe they speak Persian. There's other languages, but they don't speak English. So they don't really read much Shakespeare. But there is one play they read, and that's Merchant of Venice, because, the fact that, Israel is the enemy and Israel is seen as the main threat. And they read The Merchant of Venice. However, I have seen the exact opposite of that, right? In the Middle East, the only Shakespeare play that is largely studied is The Merchant of Venice, because they see Israel as a threat. Opposition to Israel is kind of a big part of modern Middle East Arab Muslim culture, etc. But also, I can't believe this. I kid you not. But, when I was in school, we read Shakespeare plays, whatever. But I met Zionists in New York City who don't know anything else about Shakespeare, right? I think of Shakespeare, the great playwright who wrote Romeo and Juliet and wrote Hamlet and, wrote Midsummer Night's Dream and all that. But I have met Zionists. All they know about Shakespeare is once upon a time there was this guy in England who wrote plays who hated Jews. And I'm just like, are you fucking kidding me? Right? And it's just like, and it's like it is this worldview where everything just revolves around the Jews. All of human history is just a big conspiracy to get the Jews. That's Zionism. I have met Zionists. All they know about one of the greatest writers in human history, the greatest bards of the English language, Shakespeare, is, that guy hated Jews, didn't he? Didn't he hate Jews? And that just drives me crazy. And that is how sheltered their worldview is. Zionists are, it's like everything is either a conspiracy to get them or it's unbelievable. But yes, the Merchant of Venice is anti-Semitic, and it is, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people, they've tried to say it's not anti-Semitic, right? Because there is a passage. So the Merchant of Venice is a play. It's a comedy. And it's about, basically, there's, some business owner in Venice in Italy who really needs a loan really, really bad. And, only Jews can lend money. So they go and find this money lender named Shylock, who is ruthless and evil and is Jewish. And they ask Shylock for a loan, and he says, okay, I will loan it to you, but if you don't pay me back, instead of giving me money, I want a pound of your flesh. I want a pound of your flesh. I'm going to cut a pound of your flesh, right? It's very ruthless, right? He's going to kill him, basically, to get a pound of flesh if he doesn't pay it. And then the ships sink, and so the guy doesn't have the money. And so, oh no, what he's going to do now, Shylock's going to kill him. But they find some technicality in the law. And the technicality in the law is that you can't draw somebody else's blood. So they go to the court, and the court says, okay, Shylock, here's your knife. You can take the pound of flesh, but if he bleeds, you get the death penalty. And if you don't stab him, you also get the death penalty, because the contract says you have to fulfill your thing. And so Shylock is completely screwed. He can't stab the guy and get his pound of flesh without causing him to bleed. So Shylock is outwitted. And, it's supposed to be funny that, Shylock, the greedy money lender, ends up, I think he ends up getting killed or something like that. Right. That's the Merchant of Venice. Right. And it's that this greedy money lender, now Shylock is very clearly the villain, and he's ruthless and evil, but he has a soliloquy in the play where he says, has not a Jew eyes, and if you touch him, if you cut a Jew, does he not bleed? And there's a soliloquy from Shylock about anti-Semitism. Right. And so a lot of people say, well, see, that shows Shakespeare was condemning bigotry. Shakespeare was on the Jews' side. He was against what was being done to them. No, he's not. You read the play. No, he's not. Shylock is a ruthless, evil villain. There are countless lines throughout the play about how Jews are ruthless, evil villains. It's an anti-Semitic play. But here's the thing. That soliloquy about, has not a Jew eyes is actually very profound. You could say that Shakespeare did the first villain origin story, right? Now that's a big thing with Marvel movies. They have the villain, right? And you get the origin story of the villain, right? And Shylock is the villain, but the idea is that he's a villain, he's ruthless, he's evil because of all the persecution he's been subjected to. It's that whole thing about hurt people. And that's what Shakespeare is getting at, is that this villain is so bad because society doesn't view him as human. Right. And that's the point of the soliloquies. He says, has not a Jew eyes. You watch the whole thing. He's saying, basically, in Italy, in Italian society, we Jews are forced to live in a separate area with walls around it. We're viewed as evil. We're not viewed as people. We're not treated as human beings. So because of that, he's developed this ruthlessness, this cruelty. Right. That's the point of the play. Right. Is that that Shylock is an evil villain, but it's, he hurt people, right? So it's kind of profound. And what's important about that is that at the time, you have to remember, in all throughout medieval Europe, they had what were called passion plays, which were plays about the crucifixion of Jesus, in which Jews were portrayed as monstrous, evil people, right? Crucify him, bring us Barabbas, whatever. And that these passion plays that they would do, that were really common in the Middle Ages, they were not at all deep. They were really melodramatic. Jews were ruthless, evil, scary people who killed Jesus. And people would see these passion plays and they would be so filled with anti-Semitic rage, they would go burn the Jewish neighborhood or whatever, right? It was awful. Well, Shakespeare was smarter than that. He wasn't going to write some dumb passion play. He did write an anti-Semitic play, but it was a deep anti-Semitic play. And he actually got into why the Jewish villain, Shylock, why the guy was such an asshole, why he was so cruel and indifferent. Well, it's because he's been subjected to a society that doesn't see him as a human being. And the Italian society isolates him, doesn't treat him as a human being. And he has this soliloquy about, I'm a human. Why can't I be a person? You guys don't see me as a human being, and that's why I've become this ruthless, evil villain, which is actually pretty profound if you look at it, right? Again, it is, if someone tries to tell you that because of the has not a Jew eyes part, that it's not anti-Semitic, they're wrong. It is anti-Semitic, right? Shylock is a villain. Shylock is portrayed as ruthless and heartless and cruel. It's hilarious when he digs his own grave. It's not, the play is very much an anti-Semitic play, but it's deeper in its anti-Semitism. It's deeper. The villain character is deep, and it's touching at the whole thing about hurt people. And that's what I think is important about The Merchant of Venice. And you're never really gonna get that without, kind of looking into it, right? You get the layer of people that are just like, it's anti-Semitic. Yeah, it is. And then you get a layer of people that are like, well, no, it's not because of this soliloquy. Well, it's more complicated than that. And actually, the brilliance of it is that at the time, if you wrote a play about an evil Jew, it was supposed to be, stupid, cartoonish, evil, scary Jew that does evil things. And, that's what you were supposed to get. But Shakespeare didn't do that. Shakespeare said, I'm going to make my villain have layers. I'm going to get into why this guy is so evil, and I'm going to show this guy as being the result of a society that's cruel to him. That's actually very profound, I think. The next play I wanted to talk about is Othello. Now, Othello is it's a play, and it's about a Moorish prince, Othello. This guy from North Africa, a black man from North Africa, who is a prince in Italy, and he's married to a white woman, and he's very basically he has an advisor named Iago, and the advisor Iago tricks him into thinking that his wife is cheating on him, to the point that he murders his wife and then commits suicide. And what's interesting is that it's been widely pointed out, Othello is not really about race, right? That at the time that Shakespeare wrote it, there's very few racial references in it. However, because it is very clearly written in the script, he's Moorish, he's North African, and because of the fact that, his wife is Italian and not North African, the play has been viewed throughout history from a racial lens. And that's very interesting. Paul Robeson, the great anti-imperialist, the great socialist, Marxist, writer and civil rights leader, Paul Robeson played Othello on Broadway. And that because race is such a big issue in America, and race was such a big issue in Europe and in the 1800s, everyone has interpreted that play. Racists interpreted the play as being a sign that you shouldn't have interracial marriage. Anti-racists interpreted the play as a sign of the tragedy of all the pressure and hatred that people put on interracial couples. And if you actually read what Shakespeare wrote, it's really not about that. It's not, right? You look at it, it's actually, Othello is black, but, Italy is not that far from North Africa. They're just across the Mediterranean. And it's actually, you look at it, Shakespeare probably did not intend for the play to be about race. But because of how history has developed since the time of Shakespeare, the play is endlessly read as being about race, which I find to be fascinating. The other thing is that what I take from Othello more than anything is that the villain, Iago, is the advisor, right? Othello is the king, and he's a good guy. He's Othello, he's a prince, he's a good leader, and he means well. The problem is that there is a very, very evil, self-serving manipulator whispering in his ear who knows how to push his buttons. That's the point, right? And that Othello is very insecure, right? And that's why people take it to be racial, right? The idea is this is a black man, he's married to a white woman, so he's insecure. Well, that's, again, Shakespeare, there's no sign that he saw it as a racial thing, right? Many men are insecure. Hate to break it to you, but many men out there are insecure. Women can be insecure too, no doubt. But, Othello is insecure, right? And he thinks his wife is cheating on him. But the point is, Iago, the advisor, figures out that is Othello's weakness, and he uses that to get what he wants. That says so much. I wrote a whole book about Kamala Harris and the future of America that was all about how Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and all of them are surrounded by people who know how to push their buttons, right? And that's the point, right? Is that they seek out in modern politics, they seek out people that are very, very damaged and traumatized, and they surround them with Iagos, people who know how to push their buttons to get what they want. And you talk about, if you look at how the Libyan war happened, why is it that Barack Obama, the first black president, bombed and destroyed the most prosperous country on the African continent, Libya in North Africa? Why? It's because they knew how to push his buttons, right? They knew that Barack Obama was the child of a single mom, right? That he never knew his father, and that his mother then married a general in the Indonesian military, and that little Barack Obama was living in a foreign country, right? A black child with a white mother was living in Indonesia, and that his Indonesian stepdad beat his mother in front of him ruthlessly, and he couldn't do anything about it. And that it was damage that Barack Obama had, very similar to the damage that Bill Clinton had. Bill Clinton also never met his father. His mother married a man who was an alcoholic who beat her in front of Bill Clinton, right? And it's a very similar story. And that created a certain weakness, a feeling of powerlessness. When you see someone that you love as much as a child would love their mother being harmed, being harmed and not being able to do anything about it, they knew Barack Obama had this weakness. And so they convinced Barack Obama that if he didn't bomb Libya, there was going to be a genocide, right? They told him that Gaddafi had said when he retakes Benghazi, he's going to go house to house. And they told Obama that they were going to murder everyone in Benghazi. Now, Gaddafi wasn't going to do that. Gaddafi wasn't going to kill everyone in Benghazi. They were just going to find the terrorists. They were going to go house to house and search the houses to find the terrorists. But they worked on Barack Obama, and Samantha Power brags about this, and Ben Rhodes brags about this. Ben Rhodes, who was one of Obama's top advisors, wrote a memoir where he said that's what they did. They worked on Obama for 2 or 3 days, telling him they're going to go house to house when they retake Benghazi, and everyone's going to remember that you, Barack Obama, Gaddafi, evil Gaddafi, was going to kill this whole city, and you didn't do anything about it. And they knew Obama's weakness. And by knowing his weakness, his vulnerability, they were able to manipulate Barack Obama into bombing and destroying Libya. And Obama said when he left office that his greatest regret as president was going into Libya without a clear plan or anything. He knew that he'd been had. They got him. They manipulated him. That's like Iago, right? And that Iago, the guy whispering in the ear of the king, the lying manipulator who knows the emotional weakness of Othello. Othello is very insecure, and so knows that he's very afraid that his wife couldn't really love him, that his wife would cheat on him with somebody else, right? Iago manipulates that fear for his own ends. That is the story of power, right? And that that is what they do, right? And there's a reason, all of this, right? The Order of Skull and Bones, which is the secret society at Yale that George W. Bush was a member of, George Bush Sr. was a member of, John Kerry was a member of, many U.S. presidents have been part of. What do you do when you join the Order of Skull and Bones? They sit down with you and you give them your sexual biography, and they write it down and they keep it hidden. Well, that's blackmail information, but it's not just blackmail. They have psychological information on you as well. They know your weaknesses, right? They know your vulnerabilities, your fears, any bad experiences you may have had. They sit down and they get your sexual biography. And the Order of Skull and Bones, apparently all these prominent Yale men who've been members of the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale, they have a vault somewhere with written down all of their sexual biographies. What is that about? It's about finding out their weaknesses, finding out how to push their buttons in order to manipulate them. All of this is very, very important in the world of intelligence, in the world of manipulating people, in the world of getting people to do what you want them to do, which is what the deep state and the intelligence apparatus is all about. How do we get people in positions of power whom we can manipulate? And that, what I have talked about when I wrote about the Kamala Harris book is that Kamala Harris, the people that we get to vote for are not the most important people usually. The most important people are the ones whispering in their ears. And if you start researching who Ben Rhodes is, if you start researching who Samantha Power is, if you start researching who Cass Sunstein is, you will start to see what is going on. It's those advisors. It's those strategists, right? Karl Rove, who was the advisor to Bush, right? They called Karl Rove Bush's brain. Karl Rove. Remember Karl Rove? Karl Rove was an interesting guy, right? Karl Rove, very, very interesting. So Karl Rove, his stepfather, right, who raised him, was gay. And during the campaign of 2004, right, Karl Rove ran that campaign, and they arranged for George W. Bush to win the 2004 election by putting gay marriage on the ballot in a number of states. And it was commented on in a couple different places that as that campaign that was going on, that was focused on basically whipping up opposition to homosexuality around the country, throughout that campaign, Karl Rove every weekend was flying to San Francisco to visit his stepfather, a gay man who was dying in the hospital from HIV. And people have pointed to that as an example of Karl Rove being ruthless, but it's actually a little bit deeper than that, right? So Bush's top advisor made the entire focus of the 2004 campaign opposition to homosexuality while he's visiting his gay stepfather in the hospital, and his gay stepfather is dying. And people say, well, that just shows that he's so ruthless. No, right? In a weird way, if you actually listen to Karl Rove viewed Christians as stupid. He viewed conservative Christians and evangelicals as stupid. He was an atheist. He's an atheist. And he views evangelical Christians as stupid. And he thought manipulating the anti-gay sentiments of Christians was like revenge. It was like he was using these stupid, idiotic Christian people. He was scaring them about gays in a cynical way for his own political gain to help Bush win the presidency. And it was almost like he was taunting them. And apparently this is something that Karl Rove throughout his entire career, it wasn't just the 2004 election, right? That his stepfather had been gay and he had this relationship with his gay stepfather, and that throughout the election, and even when Bush first ran for governor of Texas, he loved to stoke up anti-gay sentiments among Christians because he thought it was funny. He was like laughing at those stupid Christians and how much they hate gay people. And it was almost like a joke to him. It was like revenge. It was like, look at these stupid people. I'm going to manipulate them. I'm going to get them to vote for something they don't agree with because they don't like gays, right? You all hate gays, don't you? That doesn't make sense to a lot of us, right? We think, well, if the guy loved his gay stepfather, how could he run a presidential campaign that was focused on opposing homosexuality? But it actually fit perfectly. For him, it was like kind of this cynical revenge on those stupid working class Christians and all of that. And that's a big aspect of the rich and powerful. The bull on Wall Street. The bull on Wall Street, right? A lot of people talk about it. It's a cliche among conspiracy people. They look at the Wall Street bull and they say, that is Baal, right? That is the Old Testament deity, the golden calf that Moses destroyed, the bull that they did the human sacrifices to, the satanic deity of the Old Testament. Well, here's the thing. It is and it isn't, right? Was it built in a way probably with the Old Testament satanic deity that looks like a giant golden bull in mind? Yes. Is that because the Wall Street people literally worship an ancient demon called Baal? No. It's because if you look at, again, philosophical irrationalism, if you think about what the rich and powerful people are saying, if you read the writings of Leo Strauss, they think normal, ordinary people who believe in right and wrong are stupid suckers. And that the morality and the pretenses of ordinary people are stupid. And so they're putting an intentionally satanic image right on Wall Street to taunt and laugh at the stupid people who believe in right and wrong. And there's a lot of that. People look at like satanic imagery throughout American media. It's not that the elite are literally Satanists. The elite are without right and wrong. They are irrationalists. And they think that people believing in right and wrong and people wanting to do good and help other people is foolish. And that if you want to do right and wrong, you're a sucker. And if you want to help other people, you're stupid. In Washington, D.C., apparently, if you believe in right and wrong, they call you a Boy Scout. Oh, he's a Boy Scout, right? Oh, truth. They make fun of you if you actually believe in right and wrong. They're all about ruthlessness and political power. And so as a way to kind of mock the common people, right, there is a huge amount of doing things that are overtly satanic because it's like a joke, right? They're making fun of the stupid people who believe in right and wrong. And that was towards the end of the Bush presidency. There was some different stuff that came out, but like many of the neocon Republicans would go and spend their entire vacations at nude resorts, and their whole family, adults and kids, would go to these resorts and walk around naked all the time. And why would you do that? But it was revealed that they were doing that they were, they were going to nude resorts. And again, it was because this is something that ordinary people would be offended by. Ordinary people are offended by the idea of a nude resort. So we, as people that are manipulating those stupid suckers who believe in right and wrong and believe in Christianity and believe in helping other people and all of that, we're going to go to a resort and be naked all the time. And the conspiracy crowd, they make this kind of stuff into a horror movie, right? Our elite are getting together and sacrificing. No, they're not, right? They are and they aren't. The elite don't believe in right and wrong. The religion of the Western world is philosophical irrationalism. Philosophical irrationalism, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, as passed down to Leo Strauss, as passed down to Ayn Rand. It is the belief that there is no truth, there is no morality, and that anyone who tries to construct a truth or a grand narrative to explain human history, or anyone who tries to tell you that right and wrong exists, is being totalitarian and trying to oppress you. And that great individuals create their own truth, and that great individuals also deconstruct, and they take apart, they rip things apart, right? That's what great individuals do, is they engage in deconstruction. Right. And that, Friedrich Nietzsche, he writes about the Übermensch. The Übermenschen is the person who no one can tell them what to do. They define their own moral and ethical code. They create their own reality with their willpower, defining what reality is. That's the great individual. That's philosophical irrationalism. And that philosophical irrationalists are terrified of populism. They view populism as the greatest fear. Populism is the rabble, the masses of people, the lowly ones who do believe in right and wrong and aren't smart and enlightened like them, coming together and forcing them to accept a philosophical code or a set of principles or a truth that they don't want to accept. Right? Philosophical irrationalism is the ideology of the elite, the power-hungry, ruthless elite that think compassion is weakness, that kindness is for suckers, that want to be purely selfish, and look down on the rest of humanity that believes in kindness and compassion and right and wrong. That is what philosophical irrationalism is. And philosophical irrationalism, there's a tongue-in-cheek admiration for all things that are evil in philosophical irrationalism because they are in rebellion against any notion of order, right? Logos, right? That is the Greek word for order. And if you read the gospel according to John, right? In the beginning was the word and the word was God. The actual translation is in the beginning was the logos, the order. In the beginning was order and God is order. And philosophical irrationalists are in rebellion against order. They believe the universe is defined by chaos and that order is always an imposition, right? And that they are in rebellion against the logos and against order. And so they are in rebellion, obviously, against any notion of God, because God would be a creator who brings order to the universe. But they're also opposed to any ideology, right? It could be a secular ideology like communism. It could be but any attempt to create order in the universe, they view as totalitarian, and they view the universe as a sea of chaos through which they can swim and impose their own order and become mighty by tearing apart and ripping things apart. That is philosophical irrationalism. And, the great text that I frequently reference is Lukács, the Marxist Lukács. He wrote his critique of philosophical irrationalism called The Destruction of Reason from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, arguing that the atrocities of the Nazis and the crimes of the Nazis and fascism was rooted in philosophical irrationalism, and that Nietzsche and his philosophy very much laid the foundations for what the Nazis did. The standard interpretation that's out there nowadays is, well, the Nazis distorted Nietzsche. The Nazis took Nietzsche out of context and made it a thing to serve their ends. But Lukács argues that actually the Nazis were the logical outcome of Nietzsche, right? And that ultimately Nietzsche is saying that you don't have to have compassion or empathy for anybody. You don't have to believe that right and wrong exists. You can do whatever you want. And it is man's ultimate rebellion against order, right? And that is basically what the elite of the West believe. They are in rebellion against order. They view Christianity and Judaism and Islam and communism as the same thing, as slave morality. That's the term that Nietzsche uses. He compares Christianity to communism. He says they're the exact same thing, right? That communism is nothing but Christianity. It's Christianity dressed up in new clothes, and that it's an attempt to create a morality system that will appeal to the weak, to glorify weakness, right? Whereas strong people reject morality. That's what Friedrich Nietzsche argued, and that is called philosophical irrationalism. And that is what the elite believe. And philosophical irrationalism is satanic, not in a magical spiritual sense. It's satanic in the sense that it is very much against any notion of an ethical system and focused on deconstruction of ethical systems, right? It is about destroying order, destroying logos. Well, I'm here to tell you that we as revolutionaries and anti-imperialists, what we are trying to do is create order and build. And I heard a beautiful, beautiful poem years ago. It was recited to me by an elderly communist. It goes like this. On a busy street in a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down. With a ho-heave-ho and a lusty yell, the men swung a beam and a sidewall fell. So I said to the foreman, are these men skilled, like those you would hire if you wanted to build? But the foreman just smiled and said, no, indeed. Unskilled labor is all that I need, for I can easily wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do. So I thought to myself as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measuring life with a compass and square? Am I living my life by a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I that type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down?